Hello, my name is John Curry. I'm an academic at Bath Spa University, and my job is playing games. What I'm going to do in this talk is talk to you about Axis and Allied tactical wargaming during World War II, based on the evidence which I found. Now, wargaming during World War II was important to all sides. I mean, it was clearly important to the Germans, the British. Well, they added 3 more divisions for D-Day as a result of war games. The American Navy games are well known. The Japanese games, well, oh dear, that's an interesting one because they played their strategic war games. The war games showed in the long term they were going to lose, but they decided to try and launch a world war anyway. The Russians, well, were they planning to attack in Germany in 1941? Well, their strategic war games suggest they were. Poland, well, they gained a Russian threat and assumed Germany would be neutral, which is probably an epic fail in wargaming terms. They got it completely wrong. So it's well understood in the literature that the Axis powers began World War II with a wargaming superiority. That's just, everyone says it. But are they actually right? Well, what's the evidence for the superiority of German war games? Well, actually, it's one person. So Franz Halder wrote a very interesting report on the use of wargaming during World War II by the Germans. And when you actually look at the sources for the superiority of German wargames, so Milan's article, well, he had 17 references to Hoffman. And when you start to look at the other references to German wargaming, you realize those authors are actually sourced Hoffman. So in academic terms, this is over dependence on one source. Well, who was Hoffman? Well, he was a World War I veteran. He had a lot of command experience. I mean, he certainly did, didn't he? And at the end of the war, they sort of promoted him. Maybe it was a retirement job, general to infantry. What was the method to find the report? So the American historical branch after World War II investigated all aspects of the war to try and document it and learn the lessons. Good for them. So they found a German, Hoffman, and let's get him to write a report on war games. The problem is there's duplication throughout the report. Clearly, it wasn't edited very well. And when they talk about the war games, well, they often cite war games 3 to 7. That's the ones you read about. Even though the most important ones, well, probably the motor transport exercise in 1937, which said the German army doesn't actually have enough trucks. The second most important one is probably the invasion of Russia. Von Paulus was part of the umpiring team, and he said the logistics will fail if we invade Russia. So they invaded Russia, and the logistics failed. Wargaming was important to all sides, but the evidence actually rearranges the importance. And by saying the evidence, I'm talking about looking at the military manuals, the photos, and references in memoirs. Now, I hope to have more on Japanese wargaming during World War II in due course. There is active research going on that. And the evidence shows actually the British were the leaders, followed by the Americans, the Japanese. Germans were in there as number 4, the Russians number 5, and Poland with the epic fail number 6. But where are the tactical games? Actually, armies play a lot of tactical games. But first, you've got to understand, how do they train? Well, after training people to use weapons, drive vehicles, fire guns, all that sort of thing, you then have to practice these in units. You do field exercises, realistic field exercises. You gather and say, right, let's go and attack that hill. Let's move the battalion forward and fight through a forest. You do command post exercises, where you put people in a realistic headquarters, realistic position, back of a truck, farm, trench, whatever you have available, and you practice the procedures for war. So the messages coming in continually, orders going out continually. Maybe you have radios, maybe you're using runners. You do map exercises, well, quite a lot of those, because those are cheap, those are easy, and you can get maps of the places you think you're likely to fight on. You say, right, how do we defend this bridge? How do we advance here? How do we attack there? You also do shoots, that's tactical exercises without troops. And they're sort of a one-turn war game, because you say, the one I took part in, I remember, was the bridge demolition, for example. You say, right, bridge demolition, rear guard, where do you put out your forces to protect the bridge? When you can decide to blow up the bridge? What are some of the problems you may encounter? And they can make it slightly more realistic, as after you present your plan, the umpire can then throw some spanners in the work and say, well, what would you do if this? What would you do if you're about to blow the bridge and you realize there is another platoon closely followed by enemy tanks coming towards the bridge? Do you blow it or not? Or do you try and let them get across? Now, these above training methods are made war games when you add an active opposition. So someone who is trying to beat the people running the exercise. So field exercises, you can run them with an enemy which are told exactly what to do, or you might go all the way to a free-form exercise where the active enemy are trying to defend the wood, and it's up to them how they do it and where they fight the battle. Command post exercises where you've got multiple command posts competing against each other for each side, or maybe you have the umpires out there trying to win. Map exercises, well, you've got the teams in different rooms, and then you compare their plans. And shoots, even shoots can be run competitively. For example, one shoot is the attack shoot, one shoot is the defense shoot, and then you're comparing the plans, and then on the ground, you're asking what would happen if you do something different. What would you do if this happens? What would you do if that happens? Now, oh, that's just gone the wrong way. Right. So now we have some examples. I've published some already. The Defense of Bloodford Village 1940 was quite a good one. This I published in a book called Army Wargames, which has examples of 2 centuries worth of staff college exercises. And this is a World War II one, and it's really home guard, and it's about how do you defend a village with improvised defenses. And actually, it's quite an interesting game to play at the Wargames Club. You have the defenders prepare the village, and you don't tell the Germans who are attacking that it's any different from any other war game, except until they encounter the improvised defenses, that is. Quite interesting. Also interesting solo exercise to look at as well. Now, Valentine's Moor Sand exercises was published in Britain. I mean, it was really published. And this book is full of exercises. So it has detailed maps, which you recreate on the sand table. And then you ask the attackers or the defenders for the exercise, for the game, what are you going to do? And then the umpire gets them to talk through it as it's happening, and you pose realistic military events as they happen. This is at the tactical level. So they say, well, what do you do if one of the platoon commanders is hit? What do you do if the fire support is delayed? Do you delay the attack? What do you do if one of the tanks breaks down? What do you do if unexpectedly an enemy tank appears in this field? It was clearly popular. I mean, you look how many times that book was published. And it was published all the way from 1931 to 1964 with various updates. Now, sand table exercises in the British Army, I mean, they were serious stuff. I mean, they even produced a sand model set. There were others, but anyway, this is the Gale and Polden set. On the left-hand side, little wooden houses. And on the right-hand side, they show, that's an illustration of the book, and it shows how to make realistic sand table models. So in some ways, that's far better than a map. You know, you haven't got to be able to read a map to say, oh, look, that's fields, those are the crops, that's the road, that's the wood. Visualization, it really looks like a small scaled down version of the real terrain. And they have little model houses. Look at that little wriggly wire. And on the right-hand side, those blocks, they're little wooden blocks with military symbols on, which you then put them on the terrain. Now, the Japanese played operational level games. This is the one I like. They created a scale model of Pearl Harbor, and that's the officer punting through the flooded model. Now, we have evidence of the Japanese games for Pearl Harbor. They ran a game about the campaign for taking and occupying almost all of East and Southeast Asia. And they were destined to playing games in 1942, and they were aiming to annihilate the United States forces in the South Pacific and defeat the United States island hopping approach to Japan. And from interrogation, well, we have some idea that they did indulge in some war games for almost every major operation. But I hope to get more details about those published in due course. We know quite a lot about the United States Naval College War College rules. 1936, I published a book on them. On the right-hand side, you can see the game. They're playing it on the floor. It's really quite detailed. There's a ship card on the left-hand side. It's serious stuff. It's integrated part of their training. There's the umpire sat on the chairs, the players crawling around the floor. But, you know, it is really detailed. A lot of people are interested. This is big stuff. And there's another photograph. This is Kriegspiel in action in 1945. The left-hand side is John Bothwell. He was the last of the Fletcher Pratt naval wargamers. I interviewed him, actually. Nice chap. And this is an unpublished private photograph. They're playing a game on the floor with, I guess that's 1 in 600 scale ships. And behind them, you can see another game with a lot smaller ships, 1 in 3,000 maybe. And it's to do with something to do with lighthouse and coastal defense, defending a port, for example. Now, the US Naval War College interwar games, well, they have been held up in a high accolade by the professional wargaming community. And that's because Nimitz, the commander-in-chief in the US Pacific War, said afterwards, the war in Japan has been reenacted in the game room here by so many people in so many different ways that nothing happened during the war was a surprise. Absolutely nothing except the kamikazes tactics towards the end of the war. We'd not visualized those. And this has been held up by wargaming conference after wargaming conference, book after book, journal article after journal article, just how good their naval war games were. Well, they were good, but I actually replayed them and then compared them with reality. So I actually got up the rules, and I used some expert wargamers with extensive experience in professional and hobby gaming who know a lot about World War II. And what did we find? Well, the United States naval war games prior to World War II, they anticipated a decisive major fleet action between capital ships, a bit like Jutland, really. And the actual Pacific War, well, battles were dominated by air power, and in fact involved numerous smaller actions. In the war games, most of the gunnery actions were by day. Actually, most gunnery actions were by night. The centralized command and control of fleets, well, that was well suited with gunnery actions, but actually what happened was decentralized control is required because the battle could change in absolutely moments. And you might have your aircraft carriers here, your destroyer stream somewhere over the horizon, and your battleships somewhere else. You have to have decentralized command and control. That's actually what the Fletcher Pratt game found as well. In the war games, well, aircraft had a minor role, and actually aircraft had a major role. There was no discussion or examination of the Battle of the Atlantic, but maybe I suppose Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy actually did most of that. Now, of course, they may have played games differently from the rules and the scenarios, and they were certainly learning from the games, like Navy, Army cooperation and amphibious assaults. But actually, I found major discrepancies between those war games and what actually happened. So Nimitz's quotation made people think those pre-war games were crystal balls. They weren't. So those naval war games include examples of most of what ultimately happened, but not in the same order or with the same import as reality. The game sort of revealed possibilities that wouldn't have been foreseen otherwise, because a war game is an interactive model, and they definitely developed options to deal with it. So I developed maxims of professional wargaming, which guide how I interact with them. And basically, as soon as the senior officer makes a pronouncement about a war game, how effective it is, I immediately don't believe them. There's also the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, which is a game run in Liverpool, and it was to train convoy commanders during World War II. Remember, many of these people, English may not be their first language, though it was the language of the sea. You'd have an awful lot of Commonwealth ship captains involved, maybe warships manned by people from around the Commonwealth. And the game was a visualization as part of their anti-U-boat training tactics to demonstrate we're giving you the theory, chalk and talk, now let's practice it in a game. So you play it on the floor, little ship models, wooden ship models, wrens pushing around things or crawling on the floor to do it. On the right-hand side, you see there's screens, and to help make the game seem more realistic, the players in the game could only see the floor by looking through the screen. So it just makes the sea area look a little bit more realistic, yeah. So, was it a single game? Actually, no. And was the game always right? No. There were actually three types of game. There was an operation analysis game, and what they did was they reenacted on the floor recent U-boat attacks on convoys, looking at the after-action accounts of the escorts. And then Roberts and his team worked out where the attacking U-boat could have been, and then statistically tried to work out the best tactic to maximize the chance of catching the attacking U-boat. The second type of game was a training game, and it was teaching escort commanders how to work together and how to apply the new tactics as they were ever developing. And probably the most important use of the Western Approaches Tactical Unit game was training for D-Day. The biggest naval operation of all time, could have turned into, well, could have been a right shambles before the invasion actually began. And what did they do? Well, they played out the game in huge halls, really practicing how you coordinate the operation. So you're sort of using the game as a non-computer visualization. What do we do if? There was a strategic game. They had a map game at times which mimicked the actual Battle of the Atlantic, with the aim of establishing whether Russian escort support groups, that's the naval support groups, to support convoys under attack would actually work. And they found actually it did. So they said, for the purposes of the game, it's just as the battle is going on at the moment, but we'll create some hypothetical support groups. This is where they were. Could they actually get to those battles in real time? The Wrens really didn't like that. They thought it was just extra work and silly, but actually was important. Was the Western Approaches Tactical Unit always right? Well, no. There really needs to be a book on this, because some of the tactics proposed by Roberts and said this is what the U-boats were doing do not match what the evidence we have from the German side of what the U-boats were actually doing. But I'll publish that hopefully in another book. Now, Montgomery liked to play operational level games. He sort of played it on a map, and he got his intelligence officers to play through a forthcoming battle, basically playing out the enemy. His staff were playing themselves, and the intelligence officers were playing the enemy. And it was probably a free Kriegspiel. If you see the book Venture Simulations, which I've published, it has some detail about these games. Now, the American war games, well, at the tactical level, we have an umpiring manual, published 1942-45. The British, we also had an umpiring manual, which they used, which gave guidelines. Now, the advantage of these umpiring manuals is if you don't have people with combat experience, the manuals can give you some initial guidance and guidelines which you haven't got from actual combat. What's the chance of this happening? How many casualties will you take with this? How long will it take for the indirect fire to arrive? That's what those manuals were to do. Now, there's also a tactical game, one which was found, the Naval Carrier Wargame, Find, Fix and Strike. And this is a simple wargame. Well, the rules are simple. Actual playing it is a little bit less. And what you do is you send out your search planes, you try and locate the enemy, and then send out a strike before they locate you and send out a strike to hit you. Quite technical, actually, to have a go at. It's an interesting experience. But like most carrier war games, it's not actually that interesting to play because most of the time what you're doing, you're sending out aircraft and nothing happens. And the exciting bit is when you actually get a strike on the enemy. So we have some random accounts of war games. This one from Soldat, Reflections of a German Soldier. And he talked about how they did theory lectures, then lots of practice on the sand table or map exercises. And he said basically you had umpires, often had combat injuries, and they were using free Kriegspiel informed by their recent experience on the Eastern or Western Front. So he learned how to lead a division, how to attack, how to retreat, how to defend, etc. And he played them out on maps or in a sandbox. Now, we actually have one single manual for the Germans, a Wargames primer. And this was actually published prior to World War II, 1935. But it does give very clear examples of how the Germans planned to fight at a tactical level. Now, they use sketchmap based on the real world. So, yeah, large piece of paper and you sketch on it. The military symbols are on the right-hand side. Now, you could add some visualization to this sketch map by using little wooden houses and little wooden trees. Do they look familiar? Well, they're still sold in our toy shops today. And if you ever looked at those houses and thought, they look a bit European and a bit strange for modern houses, that's because we're still using the same type of houses and sets as they produced in the 1920s and 30s. So let's just look at an example of a map exercise war game. So if we call the top right the northeast and the bottom left the southwest. So this is a deliberate attack. The little squiggles on the map, there's a key there. So you have 3 platoons in the front line in the northeast, 1, 2, and 6 KP. So that 6 KP is from a adjacent unit. So in a lot of their war games, they always take account of adjacent units. The number 3 there is you have your reserve platoon and you have your machine guns. So what's in front of you? Well, you've got a dotted line, which is your axis of advance. And it looks like there's 2 sections in trenches on the edge of a wood line. They've got a machine gun on the reverse slope. And it looks like they've got machine gun platoon in the village of Stadel, which is on the east side. So what actually happens? Well, the umpire draws the 2 sides on the map, and the enemy positions are covered with a newspaper. The umpire briefs the players and brings in the leaders to see the map. And there's an example of the company level orders for the attack. So he gathers the platoon commanders, gives orders, short artillery bombardment, axis to advance on the compass bearing. That really is brief orders, isn't it? That's almost a hasty attack. Then the players are asked questions and given orders. Now, it's interesting to note that in the German game, they give orders in 10 minutes. A British company deliberate attack would be a lot more comprehensive. Would take up to an hour. That would include time for radio checks, ammunition checks, as in check everyone's got enough ammunition, prime your grenades, etc. Take the pins out of the mortar bombs, all that sort of thing. And In the game, the director of the game, the umpire, describes the artillery fire on both sides. Aircraft, they often abstracted to say, oh, they're just high-flying, unlikely to affect the ground battle. Now, the games initially were played out as multiplayer solos. So all the players on the German side were against an umpire-controlled opponent. And the game consisted of making the plan. The umpire would stop if the plan was ridiculous or wrong or against doctrine. And they sort of reset the game, say, right, have another go. And the game would move to event to event, so of a variable bound length. And the player would be trying, or the umpire would try to move to the decision points. So here's an example. Question 1, what do you do now? And then the umpire's solution. Question 2, to section commander 1 commander, how is your section deployed? Then question 3, platoon commander, what do you do with the platoon, etc. You get the idea. Now, can you read this map and make a plan for a fighting retreat? So let's have a look. So it's a ridge line to the north. In the center, there is a wood to the east, then a ridge line with a wood on it. And at the bottom of the map, it's another ridge line. So what do we have? We have 3 scouts, that's a little squiggly symbol, like Kalteneck on the edge of the woods, and then on the edge of the woods. And then you have on the bottom, you have your machine guns by a church tower, a couple of infantry platoons, Lash Hub, a village. You have your headquarters on the west side on a hill. See its little symbol, circle, with a line coming out the top and 2 crosses on it. Then you've got your wood in the middle with more machine guns. And then to the north, you've got a small village with a church tower. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? A fighting retreat. Now, after mastering the multiplayer solo, it then becomes a war game. What happens then? The defenders set out positions hidden by newspaper. They give orders. The attackers return to the table and they then give their orders. And the game moves from decision point to decision point. So initially, the way they play it is multiplayer solo. You're all on one side. Let's just practice getting the doctrine right, learning how to issue orders. And then you make it a war game by introducing the competition and someone who's trying to win. So what have I learned from playing the German tactical exercises? Well, German low-level tactical infantry attacks were focused on the use of machine guns and heavy machine guns. They had the rifle groups largely moved behind the machine guns in the advance, except in close terrain such as woods. And the rifle groups were there for close assaults on enemy trenches and basically to carry ammunition for the machine guns. Now, routinely, they gave short verbal orders, but they also used brief written notes. Now, the British system is very different. It tends to try and gather the leaders together for formal orders group and gives a lot clearer detailed instructions. But this takes time and it reduces the junior leader options for flexibility. In all the German war games, the junior commanders are asked, how do you implement the orders you've been given? In the British war games at the tactical level, it's how do you carry out the orders you've been given? Now, the British used battle drills to help new platoon commanders because they just had 4.5 months of training, a lot less than the Germans. But the British system was for an all-arms approach for a company attack, so 1944. Well, what would the British company have? It would routinely have heavy artillery, medium artillery, the battalion 3-inch mortars, assorted tanks, the platoon level 2-inch mortars, which might be grouped together, or you might keep them individually to provide local mortar support for each platoon. You might have your Brendan carriers, which you might use to move up to fire machine guns, move the mortars, or maybe you would just use them to carry the ammunition for everyone else. And of course, you've got your battalion level support, your heavy machine guns, the Vickers machine guns. Now, in such a scenario, unless you give very clear and detailed orders, friendly fire is going to cause more casualties than the enemy. Everyone's got to be crystal clear on unit boundaries and timings and signals for fire support. When should it move on to the next objective? When's it going to lift? How long do you fire at this for? Otherwise, with all that fire support going in, you're going to massacre your own infantry. Which system was better is an interesting question. Well, from playing the German and British tactical war games of World War II, I would say for advanced to contact and other confused confrontations, the German system seems to offer flexibility of orders and mindset. You don't know what's going on, you issue order quickly, aggression. But for deliberate attacks or prepared defences, I think the British system of formal orders was better. It should also be noted on the debate of who was actually better at fighting at a tactical level that Sidney Jarry of 18 Platoon fame, if you've read the book, pointed out his battalion won every action in Northwest Europe 1944 to 45. But it's interesting that today modern infantry training leans more towards the German system of asking junior leaders to decide how to implement the orders for themselves. So modern practice is actually to follow the German system. Well, so I've talked about the Axis and Allied tactical war games during World War II. Was the German were the Germans really the leaders in the use of war games? Well, the evidence I found says no. If you want to read more about it, I published a book, Wargames from World War II, which includes examples of these tactical war games. Well, I hope you found that interesting. Thank you.